Alright folks, so in this video what I'm going to be demoing is how to go about creating your own DSC resource inside of the Office 365 DSC. A lot of people have been reaching out to me asking me where do I even start. If I want to contribute back to the project, I know what resource I want to create, I just don't know where to start. So what we're going to do here is, first off, I've already cloned and forked the Office 365 repository to a local repo under C GitHub Office 365 DSC. What I want to do next is I'm going to be using the GitHub client for Windows. I'm going to go in and I am going to create a new branch. That branch is going to have the name of whatever component I'm going to be creating, so whatever new resource I'm going to be creating. In this case here, I'm going to be calling this Teams Channel Policy, because this is what I want to create. Right now it's not part of the project, so I want to go and create a new DSC resource that will allow me to set policies on my Teams channel. So I just created the branch. Now this is going to go in and tell me that the branch doesn't exist remotely on GitHub, so I'm just going to go and publish that. So now the branch exists both locally and on the GitHub repo, so we're good to go. Now what I want to do is I'm going to start, because I'm a little lazy, I'm going to go and just start with an existing resource, right? So all the resources are located under Modules Office 365 DSC Resources folder. And I'm just going to go in and I'm going to start with the Teams calling policy. I'm going to copy this entire folder and I'm just going to rename this to Channel Policy. Okay. So very important, all the resources for the project has to start with the Microsoft tag, so MSFT_, and then you name your resource based on what workload. So the standard we all agreed on is, after the organization acronym, you go in and you specify what workload. So we have Teams, we have SPO for SharePoint Online, we have SC for security and compliance, we do have PP for Power Platform, OD for OneDrive. You get the idea, right? So I'm going to go in now in my channel policy folder. Now you see in here I also have three files, but two of them I need to rename to match my new resource. Now I'm going to go in, rename the schema.muff. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to open the README file, because this is specific to all projects. So this one now is channel policy. And I'm just going to go and update the description. So you might be wondering what this README file is all about. Actually, whenever we go and submit a pull request on GitHub with new code changes, it analyzes the README, the example files, all the schema file, and it automatically generates a wiki page to document what the resource is all about. So this README file is extremely important, as it will appear as the header of that wiki page. Now this is done, what I can do is I can go back to my project inside of Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to go in and I'm just going to minimize this because this is a little annoying, and I'm going to go to my resource that I just created. So Teams Channel Policy, there you go, it's right here. Now, because I'm not exactly sure what properties should be passed to my my resource, I'm going to have to go and do a bit of web search. So I'm going to go in and search for CS Teams Policy. Let me just bring this up here for a sec. So I'm just going to go back here. Just give me 1 second. So I know that the Teams Channel Policy is being handled by the Skype for a Business module. So I'm going to go in and search for SC Teams Channel Policy. Alright, so I found the page. So this is the page from docs.microsoft.com, and basically what this allows me to do is, actually I'm going to go and search for the new CS Teams Channels Policy. And we can see that I have a typo in what I've created. It should be channels, so I'm going to go and rename this. But we can see that this accepts properties such as allow org-wide team creation, allow private team discovery, and so on. So those are the properties that are going to have to be reflected inside of my resource. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video, the recording. I'm going to go and rename my Teams channel to be Team Channels, and I'm just going to go and bring all the properties inside of my get target resource method. And we're back. So what I did is I updated the list of parameters for my get target resource method to include parameters that match the new CS Teams channels policy commentlet, which we're going to be using under the cover to go and interact with the Teams channels policy. Now, if you remember correctly, let me bring back the page here. If we take a look at list of properties that were accepted, we can see that there's more than just tenant, allow org-wide teams, allow private teams discovery, and allow private channel creation. There's also something called in memory. This is specific to PowerShell. We're not going to bother exposing that as part of our resource. And we have the tenant property. If we scroll down to look at the description of the tenant, it clearly states that this is for internal Microsoft use, so we should not play with this property. Therefore, it's not going to be reflected inside of our get target resource. Makes sense. The identity is going to be the primary key, so this has to be mandatory. The other ones can be optional, so we just leave the parameter metadata empty. Now, every resource that allows you to create artifacts need to specify an ensure property. That ensure property is going to be either present or absent, because with PowerShell desired state configuration, you can specify that something needs to appear, that needs to be created at all time, or you can also specify that things should never be created in the case of absent. Now you're going to see that some resources don't actually specify those properties. So if we take a look at, for example, tenant-wide configurations such as Microsoft Teams upgrade configuration, if you take a look at this one and just look at the signature of the get target resource, we don't have an ensure, because all we can do is set the properties. We don't create a new set of tenants-wide properties, right? There's no such thing as making sure that no upgrade configuration exists whatsoever. So therefore, we don't put the ensure. In my case, Teams channel policies is something that I can go and create, I can update, I can delete. So in this case, I need to go and make sure that the ensure property is there. And every resource inside of Office 365 DSC needs to specify this mandatory parameter called global admin account. This is the credentials we're going to be using to connect to the various workloads. In our case here, it's going to be to the Skype for Business module. Now I understand we're dealing with Teams, but as the time of recording, which is December 5th, 2019, we are, the commandlets to interact with Teams are still part of the Skype for Business PowerShell modules. Now, let's take a look at our overall resource. So every resource in Office 365 DSC needs to define 4 methods. The first one is get. This will return information about how a current policy is configured. We have the set. So the set target resource is all about creating a new policy, updating an existing one, or removing one that should not be in the environment. We have the test target resource, which basically returns true or false. So what you're doing is you're sending information about a policy that you're going to be defining. So you're going to say, let's say, all right, I want to make sure that my Office 365 tenant has a policy called Nix policy that as the property allow, private team discovery set to false, for example. So this is going to take that rule. It's going to go and check, is there a rule with name Nick policy that already exists, and is it configured the way you're saying it should be? It will return true or false in this case. And the last one is something that's unique to Office 365 DSC, which is the export target resource commandlet that allows you to go and extract configuration out of existing Teams policy. Now, one thing that's really, really important is that all of the 3 first methods, so the get, test, and set, all need to have the same method signature, meaning that they need to have the exact same parameters. If a parameter is mandatory for one, it needs to be set to mandatory for the other one as well. So I'm just going to go and update the signature of those 3 methods. The 4th method, if you remember correctly, is export target resource. That one should always ever take one parameter, and that is the global admin account. That's it. It doesn't need anything else. Okay, so now that all of our methods have been updated, what we're going to be doing is we're going to go inside the get method. The first thing is we're not getting a Teams calling policy, we're getting a Teams channels policy. So I'm going to update that. So this is just going to be printing out verbos when we go and deploy something. The telemetry section you leave in there. So basically telemetry is something that you can opt out of. What it allows us to capture is what resources are used the most. This is the only thing that we capture, and it allows us to figure out as well, whenever a configuration drift is detected, what properties are more often going to be drifting. Right, so this allows us to prioritize the work we're doing on the actual module. So we leave the telemetry in there. Now we can see that every get and set target resource method are going to start off by calling into the test MS Cloud login commandlet. This commandlet is exposed through a dependency that we have, which is the MS Cloud Login Assistant. So it's really important for you to understand that within Office 365 DSC, we never handle connection to the various workload. All the connections are handled through that test MS Cloud Login commandlet, which is part of an external module. So in this case here, what we're saying is, all right, we're going to be connecting to platform Skype for Business using the global admin account. So this is going to go and initiate a remote connection to our Office 365 tenant and allow us to interact with the Skype for Business components. Now, what we need to do here, so what we're trying to obtain is the actual channels policy. So we know that the commandlet's name is get. So if I go here and do get CS Teams channels, okay, so this is the one here. So this one here can take no properties when you call it, so it will return all the channel policies, or it can take identity as a parameter. Get target resource will always return information about one specific artifact or instance. So in this case here, it's really important that we try to get the current channel policy based on the identity that people passed in. And we're going to set error action to silent continue, so that if it doesn't exist, it doesn't throw an error. It's just going to set this value to be null. Now what we're going to be doing is we're then going to catch and say, all right, so if we did not find a policy called whatever the identity is, so let's take the example of Nick's policy. If you couldn't find it, so we're just going to print out a method here just saying that we could not find it. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be returning an empty array, right, that will contain the identity. So basically we'll say, right, so this channel's policy was absent. It was not on the server. So this is what we're doing here. Okay, so we're just returning this empty block. Otherwise, we did find the Teams channel, and what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be returning all the policies assigned to that Teams channel. Now let's have a quick look at how this would look. To be quite honest, I did not even run this method yet, so I'm going to go in and do test MS Cloud login. I'm going to go platform. Platform is going to be Skype for Business. The cloud is going to be, so I normally go and define a just a global variable with my credentials. So I'm going to go and connect to my environment. Should take about 10 seconds. We're going to see the module being imported, so there should be a progress bar anytime now. All right, off we go. And we're back. So now we do have access to our Skype for Business commandlet. So I can go and do Teams channels policy. So if I just run this here, it's going to come back and return two policies. So I have one called global and one called default. But we can see that it also returns information about the org-wide and Teams discovery. Okay. Now, one thing that's really interesting here is I also see description. So one thing I'm going to do is maybe the actual documentation was not up to date with the latest version. So I'm just going to go and do Teams. So I can do a description. So this is really important. So that means that when you create a new resource, a new Teams channel policy, you can pass in a description. So I'm just going to pause the video. I'm going to go back and update the signature for all of my three methods to add that description parameter, because I think it's really important for us to be able to properly let the user describe what the various components are all about. So let's pause the recording for a sec. All right, and we're back. So remember that this is live television. So again, there's no smoke and mirrors. It's the first time I attempt to create a resource for this team channels policy. And yes, sometimes our description is a little behind on the versioning. So in this case here, what I did is I added this description optional property of type string to every method. Well, the test, the set, and the get, right? So I just added description in there. So back to business. So now if I bring back that console, I can see that when I get an object return, it exposes the properties directly here with the value. So that means if we go back to our get method, whenever I found an instance of my Teams channel policy, what I want to make sure of is, I did not copy this right thing, but I want to make sure that all those properties are actually returned. So description, so we want to make sure that if we found an instance, we're going to be able to go and just return the value for that one. I'm going to go in, copy, actually, you know what, let me just bring this up here. It's going to be easier for me to follow along. I'm going to bring this back to my other screen, and there we go. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be returning all the properties. So the other one is allow team creation. So one thing is we're trying to make everything aligned. I know it's being picky, but it just saves a whole lot of time when you're trying to debug stuff if everything is all well aligned. I'm going to go in here. So basically what I'm doing is I'm returning an hash table that will expose all the properties that are part of my resource, and I'm just returning the value associated with the instance I retrieved. So now there's one left, so that would be the allow private channel. And now, as I said, I'm being picky, so I want to make sure that everything is well aligned. This one here. And I'm going to go and return, very important, I want to make sure that because I found an instance, this is the path where I'm going to be returning ensure equals present, and I also return the global and min account property. So my get function is now finished. It's ready to roll. Now let's move on to the set. Set is normally a little more tricky. So set always needs to define, well, in most cases we'll need to define 3 different logic paths. The first one is the resource, or in this case the policy doesn't already exist, but the configuration specifies that it should. So therefore we need to go and create that policy. The second one is the channel already exists, but is not configured in the desired state. So for example, maybe it currently exists, but the allow private channel creation is set to false, and our configuration specifies that it should be set to true. So there's a configuration drift. So we need to go and update the existing policy. And the third logic path is the channel currently exists. We don't care what the properties are. We know that we have a channel that exists that's called nick policy, but our configuration specifies that nick policy should be ensure equals absent, meaning that there should never be a policy called nick's policy. So in this case, we're going to go and delete that existing policy. The deletion logic path, to be quite honest, is probably the least common one that we have, but it's still something we need to be able to handle because Office, our desired state configuration, is idempotent, meaning that you can run it as often as you want. If you specify that it should not be there, it's always going to end up in that state, therefore removing any existing instances. So again, back to business. So we, first thing in the set method, we put in the telemetry. So it's always the same block that's copied over. We might be looking at simplifying this at one point, but for the moment, just play along. Just make sure you put that block at the top of the resource. We're connecting to the Skype for Business connlet. So the thing is, let's say we already called into the get. Right? So the get, if you remember, was already creating this. So we're creating a global session. So it doesn't matter if you're calling into that again. We're not attempting to create a new session. We just check to see, all right, we're already connected to Skype for Business. Therefore, we're just going to be reusing the same connection. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to obtain information about how the current policy is configured. Right? So let's say we're passing in nick's policy. We want to go and check, all right, does nick policy already exist? And if it exists, how is it configured? So we just call back into our get target resource. Now, the set parameters are going to be the parameters we're going to be using to create instances. So if we take a look at the new Teams channel policy, right? Let's bring this back. There's no such thing as ensure and global and min account as part of the properties accepted by this connlet. Those are specific to Office 365 DSC. So what we need to do is we just need to remove them both, because what we're going to be doing is use something called splatting that is just going to go in and basically call this here, pass in a hash table with properties that match the properties expected for this, and it's just going to go and attempt to create it. So if we don't remove those, it's going to go and try to call new CS Teams calling policy and pass in ensure equals present or absent, and it's going to fail because this command-let doesn't accept that property. Now, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing channel policy identity. We know that this method here is called channels. Somehow I can't type channels properly. Okay, so this is the scenario where the property, the policy should be present, but it was not found, meaning that it doesn't exist. So we just go and we create it. Now the second one is where it should be present and it currently is present. Now, one thing that I didn't mention previously, and you don't really need to understand how it works internally, to be quite honest, but the moment you call into the set target resource in any normal execution flow, it's because the test function returned false, meaning that the environment is not in the desired state. So if we get here, there's no way that the policy already exists and is already in the desired state. We know that if we enter this here, it means that the policy exists, but one of its property is not set to the value defined in the configuration. So what we need to do here is just update this. Now the set property we have not looked at yet, so I'm just going to go in and take a look at that command-let. So set teams, channels, policy. So this one here, as you would expect, takes in the identity and it takes in the same properties here. So you just need to repass the same thing. So if we just do this here, it will go and update the existing value of it. So I'm just going to go and update this here. Now the third logic path, as I mentioned, is the fact where the policy should not exist. So therefore ensure is set to absent in the configuration, but on the environment it is currently present, meaning it exists. So what we need to do is we need to go in and we need to remove it. Okay, so remove CS. So again, I just want to make sure that we can go in and properly remove that policy just by passing in identity. There we go. So I can just call in remove CS channel policy, specify which one I want to remove, and off I go. So I'm going to go do this here. And I'm just going to say basically do not prompt me to confirm. Okay, so this is done. So now our set function is also finished. We're good. The next one is the test target resource. Test target resource is fairly straightforward. As a matter of fact, the test target resource for almost all resources is exactly the same, with the exception of this verbose component here. The one thing you need to note about the test target resource is that it does not define the telemetry component. That is because it's handled inside of a different function here. So if you were to put telemetry here, it would be called twice. So therefore, we just don't put it in the test target resource. It's not a big deal if you put it, but I would recommend you don't, because it's going to create duplicates and it's going to play with the stats. Now what we're doing here is we're getting an instance of how the current policy is configured, and we are comparing how it currently is configured with how it should be configured. And that's it. So we're going to come back and return either true or false. So test is done. So the last one is the export. Again, export just like the other methods. Go and start with the telemetry. We want to make sure that we put information preference set to continue. That means that everything that is using right information is going to be displayed on the user's console. This is kind of important because the entire reverse DSC path, so the logic inside of Office 365 DSC that lets you extract configuration from an existing environment, basically does all of its verbose output, if you want, using the information channel. So you need to make sure that you set it to continue, otherwise you're not going to be able to keep track of where we're at. All right, that said, now what we're going to be doing is we're going to go in and retrieve a list of every channel's policy. So we're going to get this here. Then we're going to loop inside every policy. This here is just going to go and say, all right, so we're currently scanning policy 1 out of 2 in our environment, and here's the name of the policy. We're going to be defining the parameters to call into the get target resource. So all I need is to pass in the primary key. This is really important. The only thing you need to pass in to get target resource from here is the unique identifier. In this case, it's the identity, right? I need to pass it along the global and min account. I can definitely leave this out if I want to, because those are the mandatory properties. Now what I'm doing is I'm going in and I'm getting information about how this policy is currently configured. So this is what this is going to do. Sorry, it's going to go in loop through all the policies. So in my case here, my global and my default. So it's going to go in. The first loop is going to go, all right, so we're going to go and get the global. It's going to get information about the global policy. Now this here is basically just going to go and convert the credential object inside of the extracted configuration to a string. You don't need to understand how that works. All you need to remember is that you need to pass this in, otherwise your configuration is not going to compile. Again, this is most of the time that export target resource is going to be copy and paste, just like I did here, and then you just go and you update the various properties. And that's it. That's it. So our configuration is now done. Now the next thing you need to do is, if you remember correctly, we had three files in that folder. We had the readme file, which I need to go and update with channels, right? And we also had, well, our script file, our PSM1, sorry, our module, which I just edited. And the third one was a schema.muf file. This one here is probably the most important one. It defines what properties are expected by this resource. So what I normally do is, again, because I've copied and pasted stuff, I'm just gonna go and bring this back here. I'm gonna go and update the description for all of the properties. This is really important because this description is gonna be what's being put on the wiki page. Now, normally what I would do is I would just go in like this here, create a couple, because I know we do have, well, so the first one we have is a description. So write, and then somehow I can't type today. So description of the description parameter. I know it sounds weird, but this is description of the team's channel policy. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to define this as a string. Really important, the type for this here needs to match what is in the method signature. If they don't, you're going to get an error whenever you go and run the unit tests. Okay. Now normally what I do, as I said, is I just go and I'll copy a couple of those. Again, remember, I'm lazy. So I'm just going to go and I know that I have 3 of them. So let's just do this here, do this here, and do this here. All right, so let me just go back to our article here. I'm just going to move this aside for a sec. I'm going to go back to the list of properties, and there we go. All right, so I'm just going to go in. So the first one is a Boolean type, allow org-wide team creation. This one here is private team discovery. And then the third one is private channel creation. So, all right. Now for the descriptions. If you want to be creative, go ahead and type in your description as long as it makes sense. But again, being lazy as I am, what I do, and actually, you know what, this is the right way of doing it, is you go in and you just copy the description from the parameters description on the docs.microsoft.com site for the connect. So I'm going to go in. This is the description for my first one. This is the description for the private channel creation. And the third one is teams discovery. All right. Good. So now my schema.muf file is also ready. So right now I can start using Teams channel policy to create and to extract component. Actually, this is not quite true. In order for you to be able to extract things, there's still one last thing we need to do. There is a module here called reverse inside the, so if you take a look at the entire structure, let me just go back here real quick. I'm just going to show you the full structure. So if you go in here under modules Office 365 DSC, all the resources, as we've covered previously, are under DSC resources. And we also have a module folder that contains the utility. In there we do have 2 modules for the extraction. Right? Those are the two modules that handle the extraction. We have the graphical user interface, which you should not touch, to be quite honest. So the process we agreed on is the user interface is going to be updated as a separate PR by the core Office 365 DSC team. Okay, because otherwise the interface is still very, how would I say this? Basic. Right? It looks like it's straight out of the 90s, and just adding properties, if you have multiple people working on multiple versions or multiple resources, each updating the GUI, it is creating a mess for us to merge later on. So as part of your PR, your pull request, when you're summoning a new resource, do not touch the GUI. You need to go and modify the reverse one. So this is what we're going to be doing here. Now the reverse one is one huge module, and what it's doing, it's effectively just calling into all the various export target resources functions that we have for all of our resources. So I'm going to go in and find the team's calling policy, because this is the one I use to copy my other stuff. So this one here. So I'm going to go in and copy this, and I'm just going to paste it under. Now what I'm going to be calling this one here is Teams Channels, right? And because I'm picky, I like to see my stuff all well aligned. I'm going to go in here and simply again change this here. So basically what this is saying is, all right, so if as part of the GUI, which you have not updated yet, and that's perfectly fine, the checkbox for Teams Channel Policy is checked, then extract it. Or if you specify that we need to extract everything that has to do with the Teams workload, go and extract it. Okay? That's all it's doing. Now, channels and channels here as well. All right, so this here will allow us to go and extract that component. Now, if you want to test it, there's a way for you to hack your way around it. Just copy the name of the eventual checkbox, so check Teams channel policy. I'm just going to launch a new version or a new session here. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be calling into the export O365 configuration using the quiet switch, because if you don't specify quiet, it's going to launch the user interface. And remember that the user interface does not contain your changes yet. Now I'm going to put in my global admin account. Today is not a good day to be typing right. Great. And the last thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be calling into this components to extract switch, and I'm just going to pass in the name of the eventual checkbox. This is going to go in, and if everything is working as it should, we should see it extract the channels policy. It's going to go again right now. What it's doing, it's connecting to the Skype for Business workload underneath the cover, even though we consider it to be Teams, but it's going to go and load the module, import all the commandlets that have been found as part of that module, and we should see it go. All right, global tag default, boom. And it's going to ask me where I want to save it. I'm going to do CDSC, take a look at my configuration, and off I go. How cool is that? So it works. But our job is not done. Okay, so next thing we need to do is, if you go back to GitHub in our main folder under modules, Office 365 DSC, there is also a folder called examples. Examples has a resource folder, and every resource in there needs to define an example. This example is what we are going to be using on our wiki page. This is done automatically. The moment you have an example, your page, so let's take a look at the Teams calling policy. Right, so this here is taken from the schema.muf automatically. This here is taken from your README file, and this here is taken from the example file. So the folder needs to match the exact name of your resource. Again, being lazy, I'm going to start with the Teams calling policy. I'm going to go and rename this here. So I'm in the example folder now, really important. All right, now this here is going to be adding a new channels policy. Perfect. And back to our editor, I should be able to see my new folder in the examples. There we go. So this one here, just update the description at the top. So this example adds a new Teams channels policy. Leave everything there by default. We're going to go in and do channels policy. And this is going to be new channels policy. Now, again, you got to remember one thing is I like to save time by copying stuff over. So I'm just going to go in. I already extracted one of my properties. I'm just going to go and bring this back here. Okay. Then this is actually going to be something a little more obvious. So this is an example. All right, so we're good to go now. Now, what does it complain about? Description is not valid. So you see here right now, so I made an error somewhere. You can see that it complains right away that description is not valid. And why is that? Is because somewhere, if you take a look at the parameters list that I have there, somehow I wanted to use zoom it, but zoom it's not activated. But if you take a look, it says definition instead of description. So that means that somewhere I screwed up right here. So it's description and not definition. And what about the actual description? Okay, so that's good. Now if I go back to my example here, eventually IntelliSense is going to come back. Okay, so we're good there. Now the very last thing that you need to do is to create your unit tests. And because unit tests are a beast on their own when you're doing them for the first time, this is going to be in a separate video altogether. And we're going to be talking about how to write your own unit tests with Pester and also how to write your integration test. So thank you for following along. Please don't be afraid to reach out if you need any guidance regarding how to create a resource. What I've showed you here is what I would consider a medium resource, right? Because it allows you to create, update, and delete. We have some very easy resources that just lets you set values, and we do have some that are extremely advanced that require you to create subclasses and so on. So those advanced scenarios we're not going to be covering in videos, but feel free to reach out directly. You can find me on Twitter at Nick Charlebois, so NIKCHARLEBOIS. Or you can just ping me on GitHub as well. I am more than happy to set some time aside and do a Teams call with you to help you get started. So thank you for your time, and please contribute back to the Office 365 DSC project. Thank you.